Starlink was sold to Ukraine as neutral infrastructure, a company staying above the politics of who used it. In February 2026, that stopped being true. A switch got flipped and a private company decided who got to keep fighting. Terminals went dark on one side of the front line and stayed lit on the other. Beijing was watching. It had been watching for years. The switch didn't get flipped at random. Days before the shutdown, a Russian Guowang drone, Iran's Shahed design under a different name, struck a passenger train in northern Ukraine, killing 5 people and wounding 2. Investigators identified wreckage from a Starlink mini-terminal among the debris, evidence that the strike had been guided in real time rather than pre-programmed. That single strike is widely reported as the moment that moved Kyiv's request for a Russian whitelist ban from a standing complaint to an urgent one. A train full of civilians hit by a weapon quietly running on infrastructure built for streaming and video calls. Here's what actually happened next, mechanically. On February 5, 2026, SpaceX enforced a hard whitelist across Ukraine and the territory Russia occupies around it. Every terminal not registered through Ukraine's official channels lost service within hours. Ukraine's defense minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, confirmed it directly, saying the whitelisted terminals were working, and the Russian ones were already blocked. That's the headline version. The mechanism underneath it is more interesting and more precise than a blanket shutdown would have been. Any terminal moving faster than 90 km per hour got cut automatically, a rule built specifically to strip connectivity from attack drones without touching stationary infantry use or civilian terminals sitting still in a basement. This wasn't carpet bombing a network. It was a scalpel built to solve one problem without breaking everything around it. For the first time in the war, an entire arm of Russia's fighting force had been running on someone else's off switch, and someone else had just remembered they owned it. And it wasn't the first time SpaceX had quietly decided the rules of engagement for a war it claimed to stay out of. Back in 2022, an earlier denial of service reportedly foiled a Ukrainian attempt to strike Russian ships near Crimea, well before any public whitelist existed. Restrictions on Ukrainian military use of Starlink for offensive drone control had been in place in some form for years, enforced quietly through geofencing rather than any public policy statement. February 2026 wasn't the first time the company controlling the satellites decided how a war could be fought underneath them. It was just the first time the decision was public, sudden, and aimed squarely at the other side. The whitelist itself wasn't a single flip of a switch either, even if that's how it gets described. Ukrainian telecoms operators had already built a verification system tied to 2 existing platforms: Delta, the military's own battle management network, and Dia, the civilian government services app most Ukrainians already had installed on their phones, checking terminals against those records on a rolling basis. This wasn't a wartime improvisation built in a panic after a train got hit. Ukraine and SpaceX had already built the machinery for a controlled cutoff. The only missing piece was permission to use it. The reason for that timing wasn't sitting on the battlefield alone either. Beijing wasn't the only outside party watching closely why SpaceX finally pulled that trigger when it did, and neither of them was thinking only about Ukraine. To understand why the scalpel cuts so deep on the Russian side, you need to understand how far Russia had gone in relying on hardware it never legally owned. Russian forces had no authorized access to Starlink at any point in the war. Terminals reached the front through third countries, Kazakhstan, the United Arab Emirates, falsified paperwork and front country activation, an entire grey market built to move a consumer product into a sanctioned war zone. And by 2025, it wasn't just being used to keep headquarters in touch with the trenches. Russian drones fitted with Starlink terminals were striking targets up to 80 kilometers behind Ukrainian lines by the end of that year. Russian military bloggers themselves reported Starlink-guided drones hitting supply convoys 50 kilometers from the front in the Donetsk region in January 2026 alone, just weeks before the cutoff. This is the part most coverage of the shutdown skips entirely. Russia hadn't treated Starlink as a backup communications option. It had quietly built an entire long-range precision strike capability on top of infrastructure it didn't own, couldn't secure, and had no ability to replace on short notice, which is exactly why losing it hurt as much as it did, and why the damage wasn't contained to one part of the front. Ukrainian military analyst Ivan Stupak described infantry units left in what he called an information bubble, unable to see what was happening to their left or right, with drone operators unable to relay footage in real time. Ukrainian sources reported roughly 300 square kilometers recaptured in the weeks that followed. Worth being precise here, because the story doesn't need inflating to make its point. Ukraine's own open-source tracking project, Deep State, filed those recaptured areas under grey zone rather than confirmed liberated territory. The gains were real, they also weren't as clean as some of the celebratory coverage made them sound. The clearest damage, though, wasn't even on land, it was at sea. Russia had been planning to scale up unmanned surface vessel operations in the Black Sea through 2026, an entire naval drone campaign built around long-range remote control of unmanned boats far off the Ukrainian coast. The Ukrainian military communications advisor, Serhiy Beskresnov, said on record that Starlink terminals were the only viable communication channel for those drone boats operating near the coastline, and that Russian attempts to substitute alternative systems either failed technically or proved unreliable in actual operations. He used one word to describe what the shutdown did to that entire plan: catastrophe. Not because a single satellite link went dark for a few units, because an entire naval doctrine had been quietly built on a foundation Russia never controlled, never secured, and apparently never developed a real fallback for. China had been cataloguing exactly this kind of collapse for years, filing it away as evidence for an argument it was already making to itself. So, Russia scrambled, and the scramble tells its own story. Some units reportedly tried buying their way back onto Ukraine's whitelist, allegedly even pressuring the families of Ukrainian prisoners of war into registering terminals on their behalf. Telegram filled with offers to reactivate blocked units for a fee. Most were scams, some, according to Ukrainian claims, were run by Ukrainian intelligence itself, harvesting the exact geolocation data Russian soldiers were paying strangers to submit. Domestic terminal prices on Russia's own YAML satellite network jumped roughly 400% overnight because nothing focuses a black market like sudden, desperate demand. None of it solved the actual problem. None of it could. It would be easy to tell this half of the story as a clean Ukrainian success and leave it there. Ukrainian officials have themselves acknowledged an over-reliance on Starlink that goes back years, and they've said plainly that no equivalent exists in terms of coverage or connection quality if the arrangement ever turned against them instead of for them. The same leverage that just crippled Russian operations belongs entirely to a company Ukraine doesn't control either. The unsettling part isn't that this switch can be used against Russia, it's that the exact same switch sits over Ukraine too. The whitelist worked in Kyiv's favour this time. Nothing about the system that makes that possible guarantees it works in Kyiv's favour next time. Because the actual problem wasn't new, and it wasn't really about February 2026 at all. Russia's answer to Starlink was supposed to be Sfera, a state satellite program Vladimir Putin announced back in 2018. One prototype called Skiff-D launched in October 2022. Then nothing followed it into orbit for years. The scaled-down private alternative Bureau 1440's RASVET was supposed to put 16 satellites in orbit by the end of 2025. By the time of the shutdown, it had 6 total. Against Starlink's more than 7,000 already in the sky, this wasn't a communications gap Russia discovered the week its terminals went dark. It was a decade-long production failure that had simply been sitting there the entire time, waiting for a war to expose exactly how empty it was. And that's worth sitting with before we leave Russia behind, because it explains why this kind of leverage exists at all. Starlink sits roughly 500 kilometers up, close enough that a signal round trip takes a few dozen milliseconds, close enough to feel almost instant. That's what let it carry live drone video instead of just text and voice. Russia's YAML alternative sits in geostationary orbit 36,000 kilometers out. far enough that the same round trip turns into a noticeable delay, the kind of lag that makes manually flying a drone through it genuinely dangerous. Altitude wasn't a technical footnote, it was the entire reason one network could run a drone war and the other one couldn't, and it's the same reason both Russia and China have been forced to chase low orbit, specifically rather than settle for what they already had parked further out. Which raises a harder question than whether Russia specifically could replace a satellite network during an active war. Can any state build sovereign low-orbit infrastructure fast enough once it discovers it actually needs one, rather than assumes it eventually might? Keep that question open. We're about to watch a far richer, far more capable country try to answer it in real time, and the answer so far isn't reassuring for them either. There's a precedent for exactly this pattern from a much older technology. For decades, the entire planet ran on GPS, an American system, because building an alternative made no economic sense for anyone else. Then Moscow and Beijing separately decided they didn't want their targeting systems wired permanently into a network Washington could switch off in a crisis. So now there are 4 global navigation systems instead of 1. GPS, Russia's GLONASS, Europe's Galileo, China's Beidou, each one redundant by any efficiency measure. Each one built anyway because efficiency stopped being the priority the moment the leverage became visible. Satellite internet is running the same playbook 2 decades later, just compressed into years instead of decades, because a live war made the leverage visible all at once instead of gradually. Because Beijing had been asking that exact question long before February 2026 forced anyone else to. Chinese military writing on Starlink goes back years, and none of it reads like idle curiosity. The 2022 piece in the People's Liberation Army's own newspaper described Starlink as having deep ties to the American military, capable of carrying reconnaissance, navigation, and meteorological payloads underneath its civilian broadband branding. Researchers affiliated with the People's Liberation Army's Space Engineering University have written explicitly about countering Starlink and securing orbital resources against it, in openly military language, not commercial language. Some of that Chinese analysis conflates Starlink with Starshield, the separate, genuinely military-grade version of the network that the Pentagon operates through the same company. Whether that's a real misunderstanding or a convenient one barely matters. Either way, the conclusion Chinese planners drew was the same. China wasn't pouring state money into Guowang because Starlink looked like promising business. It was building Guowang because Starlink looked, on paper and in its own doctrine, like a weapon aimed squarely at it. February 2026 didn't teach Beijing anything new, it just confirmed a theory Chinese military planners had already committed billions to acting on. Here's where the story gets genuinely underreported, the part that never made it past specialist orbital tracking circles into general coverage. In February 2024, a full 2 years before the Ukraine shutdown, 3 Chinese Coast Guard vessels ran at high speed off Taiwan's eastern coast, broadcasting nothing. Full electronic silence, the kind of radio discipline that isn't standard for a routine patrol. Taiwanese intelligence sources assessed that the ships weren't patrolling at all. They were testing whether China's still largely unbuilt satellite network could feed real-time targeting data to the DF-21D and the DF-26B, ballistic missiles designed to hit moving warships at sea and to reach as far as Guam. A retired United States Air Force intelligence officer later ran the orbital math independently and found that the 9 Guowang test satellites in orbit that day could have provided roughly 8.5 hours of coverage over the strait near Taiwan, with several overlapping windows of 30 to 60 consecutive minutes. Not constant surveillance, not anywhere close to operational coverage, just enough apparently to run a real test. Sit with that number for a second, because it's the sharpest data point in this entire story. 9 satellites, not thousands, 9. China field-tested a missile targeting application of a satellite network 2 full years before it had anywhere near the number of satellites required to actually operate one at scale. That's not a company shipping a product early to beat a competitor to market. That's a state confirming a specific military capability works in a live test near a contested strait, well before it commits the enormous industrial resources needed to build that capability out to a size that matters. The scale China has since committed to is enormous on paper, and it's worth laying out in full before getting to why the paper and the reality don't currently match. Guowang alone is filed with the International Telecommunication Union for nearly 13,000 satellites, split across 2 orbital shells at different altitudes, 1 lower shell built for dense coverage, and 1 higher shell built for broader reach. China SatNet, the state enterprise running the program, reports directly to the government body that oversees state-owned assets. This is not a startup chasing a broadband subscription model. It is a sovereign infrastructure project wearing a telecom company's paperwork. But paper commitments come with paper deadlines, and this is where the real clock on this entire story is actually ticking. Under International Telecommunication Union rules, China has to launch at least half of Guowang's filed satellites, roughly 6,500 of them by 2032, or lose the spectrum rights it locked in back in September 2020. That deadline has nothing to do with Ukraine and nothing to do with Taiwan. It is bureaucratic, self-imposed, set in motion years before the war made any of this feel urgent to anyone. Outside a handful of aerospace lawyers. And it is now, without much public discussion of it, the single hardest constraint China's entire satellite sovereignty program is racing against. 6,500 satellites, 6 years. Nobody in Beijing signed up for that pace expecting a war in Ukraine to make it urgent. They signed up for it in 2020, filed the paperwork and moved on to other things. The war just turned a bureaucratic filing deadline into something that actually matters. As of March 2026, Guowang had roughly 163 satellites in orbit. The stated plan from Chinese state media is 310 by the end of this year, 900 in 2027 and 3,600 a year starting in 2028. Reaching just this year's target alone requires around 34 dedicated launches on a single rocket variant, the Long March 8A. China launched 92 rockets total across every civilian, commercial and military program combined in all of 2025, and is reportedly targeting as many as 140 attempts across this year, including its own lunar and crewed spaceflight missions competing for the same pads and the same production lines. Guowang deployment by itself could consume roughly a third of the country's entire national launch capacity this year. This isn't really a story about satellite counts anymore. It's an industrial mobilization problem, and right now China's launch industry isn't mobilized fast enough to hit a legal deadline the country set for itself. Part of the fix is supposed to be reusability, the same idea that let SpaceX collapse its own launch costs years ago. China is developing a reusable variant of the Long March 12 specifically to bring per-launch costs down and push cadence higher, but that vehicle is still working through development rather than flying on a routine schedule, which means the country is trying to hit an industrial-era production target, using launch technology that itself hasn't finished maturing yet. There's physical evidence too that Guowang was never designed to be purely about broadband, evidence that doesn't rely on speculation about intent. Chinese state media has released almost no technical detail on the satellites themselves, no mass figures, no capability breakdowns, nothing close to the level of public disclosure SpaceX routinely puts out about Starlink hardware. But based on what different Long March rocket variants can actually lift into the specific orbits being used, analysts have identified 2 distinct satellite classes within the constellation. One estimated around 16,600 kilograms, the other closer to 889 kilograms. That's not a size difference you'd expect from 2 generations of the same broadband hardware. China's own satellite manufacturer, the China Academy of Space Technology, has confirmed it built both a large platform and a small platform for Guowang. It has never explained what the large one is actually for. Guowang isn't China's only bet either, and the second one is arguably more aggressive. Qianfan, sometimes called Thousand Sails, is the commercial half of the same push, run by a Shanghai-backed company rather than a central state enterprise, and it's targeting 15,000 satellites of its own by 2030. Each Qianfan satellite reportedly costs under 10 million yuan to build, close to 1.5 million US dollars. A flat panel design engineered specifically to stack tightly inside a rocket fairing, so more of them fit per launch. Qianfan has already signed service agreements in Brazil, Malaysia, Kazakhstan and Turkey, positioning itself as the export product Guowang was never designed to be. It hasn't been a clean production run either. A batch of satellites suffered thruster and gyroscope failures in 2025, and deployment stopped cold for 7 months before resuming in April 2026. Between the two programs, plus several smaller constellations in development, China's combined low-orbit satellite ambitions add up to something over 50,000 planned spacecraft. On paper, that's not competing with Starlink, that's trying to outbuild it. Now, the obvious objection to all of this: if China only has a few hundred satellites in orbit against a target of thousands, does any of it actually matter yet? A resilience media investigation into Guowang quotes space security analysts making exactly that argument, pointing out that the network currently lacks the coverage density to function as a real substitute for Starlink in an actual conflict, and that comparing the two by name invites people to assume a parity that doesn't exist on the ground or in orbit today. That's fair, as far as it goes. It's also not really the point. Nobody tests a missile targeting application on 9 satellites because 9 satellites are useful. They test it because the war they're planning for is years away, and by the time it isn't, they intend to have the rest of the constellation already built. The gap between capability today and capability intended for 2032 isn't evidence the threat is overstated. It's the entire reason the ITU deadline exists in the first place. Deadlines don't get written for capabilities nobody's worried about. 4 months after the Ukraine shutdown on June 12, 2026, SpaceX went public. Opening valuation, $1.75 trillion, the largest initial public offering in stock market history. Starlink alone accounted for 61% of SpaceX's total revenue that year, $11.4 billion, and had crossed 10 million subscribers just months earlier. The company that had decided in February who got to keep fighting a war was, at that exact moment, filing the paperwork that would prove to regulators and to a global pool of retail investors that it followed United States sanctions law cleanly and without exception. The shutdown was announced publicly as sanctions enforcement against fraudulent, unauthorized use. It was that. It was also a company sitting on an enormous financial incentive to look compliant, right before the biggest public debut any company has ever had. Both of those things are true at the same time. Neither one cancels the other out, and pretending it has to be one or the other misses exactly how these decisions actually get made. So here's where all 3 threads in this story actually meet. A private company weaponized a dependency it had spent years insisting was purely commercial, for reasons that were simultaneously principled and financially convenient, and got away with calling it neutral infrastructure for most of 4 years before the difference became impossible to ignore. China noticed the underlying vulnerability years earlier than that, tested a working version of that exact leverage against Taiwan in February 2024, and is now racing to build a sovereign alternative on a legal deadline it currently cannot meet. 163 satellites in orbit, 6,500 required by 2032. That gap is the real story here, more than any single satellite launch or any single Coast Guard maneuver off Taiwan's coast. None of it required a single act of sabotage. A company protected its own compliance record and its valuation. A government used the leverage that decision happened to create. And China is racing to build a version of that same power before anyone gets the chance to use it against them. Right now, it is losing that race by a margin counted in years, not months.